because killing slaves is wrong, but because mismanaging a trip, the voyage is wrong. So because we would call contributory negligence. Well, all of this that I've just told you about in hugely more detail, plus more graphic detail, through this court case, is public knowledge in the newspapers of England, provincial newspapers, newspapers in this country, in the American colonies, newspapers on the continent. So this story, with all its very specific facts and horrors, becomes known everywhere. Now, I want to show you. This is actually mine. I bought this at a used bookshop in Paris. But what's interesting about this? It's from a late 18th century magazine. It's actually an encyclopedia, and the text that you see before is in 4 languages, and you see up here it's in 4 languages here. Miscellaneous subjects, miscellaneous subjects, miscellaneous subjects, and miscellaneous subjects in Latin, right? So this is international news. And what you see here is this interesting juxtaposition of, on the one hand, a version of the Clarkson picture, right? And of a kind of Equiano-like narrative of a child being ripped from his mother by the slavers who take her to the boat and destroying this family. So by the 1790s, this sort of facticity and this emotional story are put together in one kind of representation, which is making its way in many of the languages of Europe. Are we getting to an answer? Happier? A little bit happier?
Not really. No.
Not happier, okay.
Well, when we talk about this sort of sentimentality, it's brought out as though it's sort of an evolutionary shift in societal views. But it seems more, and I'm not being fair right now because I'm talking about current, what we know to be true now, but it seems more that it's a temporary state that can easily slip back because we've seen modern societies that apparently had this evolutionary shift in sentimentality shift almost in a decade into utter brutality.
Within, not even a decade, within years, months.
Yeah.
Absolutely right. And it's a hugely important criticism, and I'm going to get to this at the end. One thing to say is, look, there is no human progress. And in fact, if anything, the age of humanitarianism and the age of human rights documents is worse. We have more genocides. I mean, the Holocaust didn't end genocides. It started genocides. Started them. There was a series of them, and the wars in Africa now make 19th century wars in Africa, horrible as they are, pale by comparison. So you're totally right. In other words, this is not a universal solution to the problem of inhumanity. And there are lots of historical contingent facts. Well, people have always argued over the years, this is just feeling, has no reason, and is going to fall apart. What I want to just at the end, some of this starts having legal justification. We're supposed to do it, so we don't always follow the law, but we do some of the time. There's a justification for humanitarian intervention, and there's the foundation for something which actually is some sort of engagement. The Berkeley students would not have done this. They weren't Berkeley students, but Harvard students in the 18th century didn't engage in these kind of things that Berkeley students in the 20th century are engaging in. That sort of universal caring. So I totally take your point. And I think you must have all thought this. This is not the solution to world misery. And that's a criticism that is made for human rights and for humanitarianism generally. That's why Moyne calls this a utopic. But what I'm trying to suggest is that you can have a kind of utopic vision and you can have a real politics. And that this humanitarianism does actually result, and I'm going to end with this, with legal mandates to engage in humanitarian action, which are sometimes met and sometimes not. But at least they're mandates, they're norms. And the norms are backed by this elaborate structure of feeling. So I don't want to, and we'll come back to this, your criticism a bunch of times in the course, because it's a real and deep criticism. Okay? I don't want to, but I just want to say, we do have a historical question to explain. There is no anti-slavery movement, and there is one. There is no infrastructure of facts and of communication about the suffering of the world, and then there is one. There's no intervention internationally in what was taken to be humanitarian crises And then in the 19th century, there is. So we don't have to sort of argue that it solves everything, or even that there's less horrible things going on. I'm just saying we have to explain why the interventions that do happen. And that's what I'm trying to get at, give you this historical background for a structure of humanitarianism which is still around today with many of the same difficulties that were around, which people understood to be around in the 18th and 19th century. Okay, I just want to show you this abolition of the slave trade was actually consequential, but it didn't end it because other countries that didn't give up on the slave trade continue to do it. And this is also then one of the very first instances of international intervention in human rights, in humanitarian issues, because the British Navy took upon itself through particular treaty relations with different countries, who in principle said they were going to abolish slavery, but in fact didn't patrol their own merchant marine. The British started stopping boats on the high seas and liberating slaves. And it's said often, well, look, this is just Britain's effort to become the hegemon, as we now say, in international relations of the high seas. But it probably isn't, and it cost the British a lot. I mean, about 4,000 British sailors died in the controversies about stopping slave ships. So it was not inconsequential. It's not even clear it's the British national interest. But it was pushed by the politics of humanitarianism in Britain. So the slave trade ends, the British slave trade ends here. Slave trade to other countries are still going on much later, and Britain becomes important in interdicting those. Okay, so I just want to, now we've talked about the literature of this and the issue of facts, I want to also say, look, there's an art of this. And this art of the suffering of slaves, first in painting, and then in etchings, as I showed you before, and then in photography, is ubiquitous. And I'm going to show you a series of pictures now, just over time, which you see is the common visual vocabulary of suffering at a distance. That's what I'm trying to illustrate here now. So, let me see when we get to these. I'm sorry, I'm a little ahead of myself. Let me hold that thought. I'm holding the thought. Okay, so we have these facts. Then we need to make clear that these people who suffer are in fact in some way like us, and that works. I want to suggest I want to suggest as a matter of capacity through the imagination, through the fact that we can think of ourselves in the position of other people. And again, Adam Smith is the great theorist of this, and he actually wants to suggest that the thought in the imagination substitutes for the sound of a cry. So earlier on, I gave you a text from the early 18th century which says if you hear a cry, you respond to it. Smith says if you imagine a cry, you can, under the circumstances, respond to it. So the imagination is actually crucial in this, and that's where art comes in and literature comes in. And that's why this course has a fair bit of novels and art and movies in a little bit. Because all of those are really important in human rights and humanitarian work, because they allow us, or they allow our imaginations to connect with these other people, and then, in a way I'm going to show you in a moment, feel we have an obligation to do something. So let me just give you one example of this. A freed slave in Britain, painted by one of the most important portrait painters of the period, Gainsborough. Joshua Reynolds, another of the great important British painters, paints, we don't know who this person is, an African. Now what you see in both of these pictures, and what you'll see in this one, and in Equiano, these are not savages. That's the central feature. You think African, do not think savage. Think someone who could be a writer of this novel, who could be a beautiful and refined-looking person, who's dressed as a gentleman. Right? So the art lets you say, okay, you read about this African, so we don't think of these people as radically different. They're like us. If you put different clothes on them, they're like us. In fact, they're not only like us, they're like the upper classes of us, which means they really are